Hi everyone, we're so glad that you've joined us at the Center for Brain Health for our event. Let's get started with a brief video underscoring the importance of brain health for you and for society. After that, we'll introduce our speaker.
We work, we live, we innovate and create. At the center of it all is your brain health. The ability to solve problems, think analytically, share empathy, and thrive.
We're trying to make brain performance really the next fitness revolution.
So how do you boost brain power? Welcome to the Brain Health Project, an urgent call to transform your mind to work stronger and faster.
This is an absolute crisis as great as any we have ever faced. We have to equip the minds and brains of our citizens to cope with the accelerating, dizzying rate of change that they face in their lives.
Your brain health is not fixed. Scientific discoveries prove it can adapt and grow regardless of your starting point.
Our greatest value, the asset that will help us to change everything, every problem we're in, is all in our head.
To harness that treasure, we must measure and monitor progress while things are going well versus waiting for an injury or disease to strike.
Too many of us are outliving our brains, and that does not have to be the case.
The information age is bombarding us with more content than our human brains can handle. How do you keep from getting lost in this? And focus on deep thinking. For starters, stop multitasking.
Science shows us that multitasking is bad for your brain. It reduces fluid intelligence, causes brain atrophy, and increases chronic stress.
The global pandemic is creating more stress than ever, stress that leads to depression and anxiety and beyond. Unlocking our potential to navigate these hurdles starts with learning the right strategies, even in school.
So when teachers have these strategies, they're empowered to support our learners, and then the learners are now able to take ownership of their learning.
Training kids how to think is doubling academic achievement among middle schoolers.
I think the greatest national security threat is pre-K through 12. If we don't take care of educating our young men and women, then we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to be in 20 years?
Our world-renowned scientists know you can increase your brain health, not lose it. It's time for a new category of health, brain health. You are a game changer. Ready to transform the world with us? Be a part of the brain health revolution. It starts here.
Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Center for Brain Health, welcome to the Frontiers of Brain Health lecture series, where we take a deep dive into some of the most exciting and innovative areas in brain science. I'm Dan Krawczyk. I'm the Deputy Director here, and I facilitate a lot of this cutting-edge research. We will have a few minutes for questions afterward. We have both an in-person and an online audience, so as things occur to you, either mention them in the Q&A function online or just save them, obviously, for the end. This is also being recorded. For those of you who do not know a lot about the center, we are a cognitive neuroscience center affiliated with the University of Texas at Dallas, and we have spent the past 3 decades exploring the exciting possibilities of neuroplasticity, the potential of the brain to get stronger and work more effectively. So I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, who has worked with me for the past 5 years in my lab studying reasoning. Michael Lundie came initially from Southern Methodist University nearby, where he did a bachelor's in philosophy. He then answered the question, what do you do with a philosophy degree? He went into neurophilosophy at Georgia State and did a master's there. That wasn't close enough to behavior just yet. So continuing in this theme from kind of like studying the mind to the brain to behavior, Michael then came to UT Dallas to do a PhD in my lab, and we have worked together closely. He found cognitive neuroscience to be the methodology at which he could best approach these kinds of questions that interested him. Over the years, he's done studies in EEG, recording responses during reasoning. He's done brain stimulation work and linking that to judgment and decision making, which we'll talk about today as well. Then the pandemic hit in 2020, which is a very difficult time to be a PhD student. And what Michael did with the pandemic was pivot to online data collection. So he got less personal with participants and took a more global view. And he got into this work studying politics. I barely need to say the state of our politics are extremely divided. The way Michael has tried to address this is looking at confirmation bias and the implications for political extremism and polarization. He just was the runner-up at the 3-minute thesis contest. Congratulations to him last week. It's a proud moment for any advisor. And given that Michael's into politics, this looks like a polite crowd, but politics gets contentious. Be forewarned, he's a jiu-jitsu grappling expert. So when the question sessions come in, keep that in mind. I think about analogies a great deal in my work, and Michael does as well. Earlier on, we explored creative analogy making, and the characteristics of a creative analogy are that it's cross-disciplinary. It borrows from one discipline and applies it in a new and interesting way in a different discipline. It's also intellectually stimulating, exciting, and gives you this aha moment of insight. And I think that is exactly what the experience of advising Michael has been these past several years. It's been constantly cross-disciplinary, philosophy, neurophilosophy, politics, all coming together in behavioral research. That is exhilarating, exciting, and I hope to do more of it in the future. So let's go ahead and welcome Michael Lundy.
Thank you, Dan, for that very generous introduction. And I'm very excited to be a part of the Frontiers lecture series and to showcase some of the findings from this new foray of research that I've engaged in for these past couple of years. So without further ado, we'll go get started here. So my talk today is going to be about this exploration of the metacognitive underpinnings of confirmation bias and its political consequences, a mouthful. But we'll take it piece by piece and also show a roadmap of how we're going to tackle each of these constructs, how they interact with each other, and what insights we can draw, and how they can be applied to our daily life circumstances. So our roadmap for today is, of course, I'm obliged to do some background work here to give ourselves a working understanding of the relevant concepts, followed by the research aims that lie at the very heart of this project, the methodology that I used in order to form assessments and make sure that I'm doing my due diligence to assess the hypotheses and present the experimental results that followed. And then we'll discuss some exciting future directions. And then we'll segue straight into the Q&A to hear about everyone else's feedback and thoughts on these very interesting questions. So, beginning with our background. Confirmation bias is probably something we've thought about or heard about before. And it usually shows up in our daily lives along these lines. So there's an interesting issue. Perhaps it's a political topic. Could be climate change, could be gun rights, any other number of things that capture our interest and tends to generate a lot of heat and conversation and debate. So we think, well, all right, I'm a rational individual. I want to know the real truth of the matter. So I'm going to approach this as a rational person would. I'm going to go ahead and Google the topic, and the very first link that I see that agrees with what I already think shows, oh, well, how about that? Turns out that I'm right. Well, that's fortunate. And that's where it tends to end. And then we trot this phrase out like, oh, I did my research. Oh, you did. You looked at a few YouTube videos, and you walked away believing that you were right about the thing you already thought. That tends to be the pattern. We easily see it in others, but the truth is it shows up quite often in ourselves in those honest moments when we assess our own behavior. And my question here was, all right, this stubborn facet of our minds, confirmation bias, consists of this reluctance to change our minds. And it tends to fall into two basic properties of attributing undue authority to data that supports the beliefs that we start with, these priors that we have, but also underweighting the contrary evidence or ignoring the contrary evidence altogether. Where does this come from? What do we do about it? It turns out to be a ubiquitous phenomenon. Confirmation bias is perhaps the best known and most widely accepted notion of inferential error to come out of the literature on human reasoning. Kind of shows just how commonplace it really is. And as for the applications of this, I think there's been a great deal of attention in the past few years about this phenomenon, the ways in which it exploits the weaknesses of our minds. For instance, on Netflix, if you want to learn a bit more about this phenomenon, how pernicious it can really be in our online life, you can check out The Social Dilemma, great documentary showcasing how algorithms and social media tend to feed us the things that we want to believe in, encase ourselves in our own little Truman Show, a reality of our own making and our own curating that confirms the beliefs that we already hold, giving us this outsized sense of confidence, swelling confidence about the beliefs we have. Now, to look at some data here to kind of motivate the problem. Most of us now turn more and more to news websites. And if you look here in what's highlighted on the far left on these graphs, we see that those who are skewing younger are relying on online social media to gather information, to have a working understanding of the world around them. The question is, how reliable is this information? We just talked a little bit about how algorithms can feed us information that we want to see, the things we already think are true. We can see how that would exacerbate any of the issues that would have been in place long before social media ever became a factor in our lives. Trust in mass media in general has been taking a hit in the past few years. The question, though, is social media really to blame in all this? Mass media in general has been declining, and that goes for those who skew to the left or to the right, liberals or conservatives, people who are moderate. Turns out that we have a general sense of frustration, maybe even despair, as far as thinking, well, what do we do in this impossibly complex world? Who can we trust? Who do we turn to? One topic or trope that really kind of crystallizes this issue is the whole phenomenon of fake news, misinformation, disinformation, where it's willfully trying to deceive us and skew our minds away from what the truth of any given subject is. And we can see here that it's becoming more and more of a prevalent issue. We're becoming more and more aware of this problem, figuring out, okay, anytime I see a link online, like we saw in our little cartoon to begin with, how do we know whether it comes from a trusted source? What criteria would I use to know whether or not I can trust it? All this contributes to conspiratorial ideation, misinformation susceptibility, meaning this way of seeing the world in very hostile terms, where this is made possible by sprawling networks of media organizations echoing false claims to a receptive audience. See, the more you see something, the more you repeat the perception of a statement, the more it appears familiar and true. Our brains have a difficult time distinguishing between familiarity and things that feel true to us. But what gives rise to this conspiratorial ideation, this sense that the world is sort of haunted by threats, by those from the other side who are out to get us? I mean, typically when you have a strong political view, it's typically galvanized in such a way where you're the hero of your own story with your own political tribe, and then you've got this other political tribe who only means you harm, doesn't really have a good nature, doesn't have good intentions for you and the values that you would represent. What contributes to this is ideological polarization, dogmatic intolerance, authoritarianism. All these are the pillars that prop up this conspiratorial way of seeing the world around us. We'll take each of these in turn. Ideological polarization refers to this phenomenon of there being a gulf, a rift in our political lives, where we see this sorting of individuals into being for one team or another. We take something as complex as our values, the way we see the world, what we consider right and wrong, what justice is, and we put little labels and boxes around it, simplifying things, taking very complex individuals and human beings and reducing them to just a label. Oh, you're a conservative, you're a liberal, you're this or that. So we don't have to think anymore. I know whether you're a friend or an enemy, and we stop there. Dogmatic intolerance, where I plant my feet firmly in my belief system, and anyone who doesn't share that belief system that I hold, I won't tolerate your existence. I won't tolerate your presence. I have nothing to learn from you. You're an enemy, after all. And the irony, of course, is that we're looking at the mirror image of ourselves with that same sense of rectitude, that same sense of, I'm the hero of this journey, right? This is a familiar phenomenon where we all feel like we love America, and yet it's the other people who constitute this country who wind up being the great threat. But again, it's mirrored. Authoritarianism. To wrap our heads around what this concept refers to is this willingness to countenance authority figures to impose our norms and our values on the world around us. It's not just that I don't tolerate you, it's that I want to see your minds changed. I want to see whatever belief system I have printed out as a carbon copy and inserted into the skulls of other people. It's part of the reason why we engage in wars online, on Twitter, and social media, right? Where we bludgeon each other with our words because I want to get you to conform to my belief system. And any help I can get along the way from those who I see as trusted authorities, I'm more than willing to accept that. Here's the problem, though. Democratic institutions don't last long under these conditions. They're highly destabilized when you have a polity, when you have a public that can't work together, doesn't trust the goodwill, good nature of fellow citizens, instead seeing them as somehow anathema to the continuation of the society that we hold. One thing that really caught my eye and motivated me to do some of this work, the sense of urgency, came from Center for Politics at the University of Virginia, a poll showing a decreased commitment to democracy in general. What I've highlighted for us here is a questionnaire in which a set of those who voted for Biden in the last election and those who voted for Donald Trump in the last election in 2020 were queried on their sentiments about these statements. So here's one statement that's a bit concerning. This gets to authoritarianism. It would be better for America if whoever is president could take needed actions without being constrained by Congress or the courts. In other words, those restrictions, right, those manacles that hold down those who would be tyrants, right? Let's do away with those chains. Let's do away with checks and balances because they work for me, right? Well, it looks to me like nearly half of the respondents were more than happy to see that happen. 46% among Biden voters, 44% among Trump voters. The next statement, the situation in America is such that I would favor blue-red states seceding from the Union to form their own separate country. So the whole idea that, well, we can't work together. It's better off if I'm just surrounded by those in a homogenous community who think the way I do. Those are the only ones I can trust. Again, we see nearly half of respondents from this group of almost 2,000 respondents favoring this particular sentiment. So what do we do about this? Do we throw our hands up, say, well, how unfortunate, I hope we all survive? Or do we do something about it? Well, I say we do the latter. And I think as researchers, as scientists, as psychologists and neuroscientists, we bring to bear the tools that we have to offer to shed some light on first diagnosing what the issue is and then offering prescriptions. What's normative? What can we do to right the ship on its course? So, of course, forgive the tired metaphor of the iceberg, but what we've just discussed here is just the tip of the iceberg, right? We're talking about how it shows up in these very flamboyant displays of carnage in our political lives, but beneath the surface, if we really tinker with the engines of our minds, we'll see what actually drives this behavior and what can be done about it. I've drawn inspiration from a researcher named Steve Fleming at a University College at Lundie, the Meta Lab, who's taken on this problem and put it front and center as a priority. So he and one of his students, Max Rovaga, who you see facing left and right on this image here, they're fascinated by a construct called metacognition. It's the capacity for our minds to reflect upon itself. It's one thing, it's a hallmark of human cognition, that we're capable of taking the lens of our perception, not just taking it to the external world, what I'm seeing in front of me, but I can turn it to the milieu, the internal milieu of the interiority of my mind, and understand certain patterns that lie at its fundamental basis. how it works. Knowing weaknesses about myself, right? Knowing if I'm an intelligent person or not, if I'm honest or not, et cetera, et cetera. They want to understand what are the neural correlates of this. And here's the question. Are some of us better at this than others? Some of us real mental athletes when it comes to ruthless introspection and assessing the contours of our own minds. The construct they came up with for this trait, this capacity to be better or worse at this ability to reflect on one's minds and have an accurate understanding of, well, say our own beliefs and judgments about the world, is known as metacognitive sensitivity. Are you sensitive to the elements of your own mind and able to make accurate assessments of, let's say, whether you have a belief that is in fact countenanced by the evidence available to you? Is your confidence in registry with the evidence available to hold that belief to begin with? The way they assess this is quite clever, and it might have you kind of giving a little quizzical, tweak of your brow, like, I'm not sure where you're going with this. Well, here's what they did. They came up with this perceptual judgment task that you see displayed right here. If you look at the very top of the screen, the participants who had engaged in this study in an online format, what they would do is they would look at a pair of black boxes. It would show up on the screen. So imagine before you got two little black boxes with little flickering dots, little white dots, and they show up for just a fraction of a second, 750 milliseconds. And in that span of time, the boxes disappear, and you must decide which of the two boxes had a larger number of dots, left or right. So you make your choice, left or right. And then what comes next, crucially, is the opportunity to change your mind, or not, with post-decision evidence. So here we have either the same stimulus or a stronger version of the stimulus where the ratio of the dots is altered so it's easier to find the correct answer. So respectively weak and strong evidence conditions. And you have a chance to register your confidence level. Either you think, you know what, I changed my mind here, I was wrong. Or you say, nope, I'm sticking to my first view. And what they had discovered in their research, Rovaga and Fleming, is that there's a way to compute metacognitive sensitivity such that you average out all the hundreds of trials of doing this task. And the extent to which your confidence levels, in this case, if you look on the graph on the left, if you have low metacognitive sensitivity, the distribution of confidence levels almost overlaps for when you're incorrect and when you're correct, meaning you're at chance. If I ask you, how confident were you? If you have high confidence, who knows if you were right or wrong? Because your confidence is actually not even related to your accuracy at all. You're not very good at telling whether or not the evidence that you have in favor of your beliefs really justifies your sense of certainty that you have the correct answer. And below that, we see an example representation of what high metacognitive sensitivity would look like, where the low confidence ratings from like say 0 to 50, they would show up more so for when you're incorrect. Meaning, yes, your confidence is low when it should be low because you're wrong, right? So let's hope that you have low confidence when you're wrong. On the other hand, on our green line, you have higher confidence when you're correct. You're a good authority, you're a trustworthy source on whether or not you know when you're right or you're wrong. And now, for the application part of this, what they discovered is that for those who were political moderates, moderate political views, and those who had radical political views, they had differences in their metacognitive sensitivity. Those who had moderate views had higher metacognitive sensitivity than those who had radical political views. Very interesting finding. Caught my attention and made me wonder, well, how much further can we push this? What else can we learn about how using metacognitive sensitivity could give us some insights into other psychological aspects that underlie political extremism, or in this case, conspiratorial thinking? So that brings us to our research aims. First thing I wanted to find out is whether or not metacognitive sensitivity could be assessed not just in the perceptual domain that we saw a moment ago with the dots, but how about in a more reasoning-based domain, more abstract thinking? Would one's metacognitive sensitivity, if low in one domain, is it low in the other with more abstract thinking? And likewise, if you have high metacognitive sensitivity, is it robust in the sense that it's also high in a reasoning-based domain? The next aim was to measure the link between metacognitive sensitivity and confirmation bias across perceptual and analytic task domains. The way I wanted to do this was to see whether or not one's confidence levels when you're incorrect, if they decrease the way they should when you're giving corrective evidence. Are those with high metacognitive sensitivity more likely to do just that? The final aim, of course, going from the continuum of looking just purely at mind to behavior, to application. This is where we see the application part of it. Well, does it matter as far as predicting political thoughts, political judgments, political attitudes? So we want to know, does lower metacognitive sensitivity lead to increased levels of spiritual ideation, ideological polarization, dogmatic intolerance, authoritarianism, etc.? And also, susceptibility believing in misinformation. To actually put into application this whole study, how are we measuring this? I have developed 3 behavioral tasks. This perceptual judgment task, which is sort of a little spin-off on Fleming and Rovaga's task, and an analytic decision task, which is a more reasoning or abstract thinking-based version of that very same task, and then a misinformation susceptibility task that uses stimuli from another researcher, where you have a mixture of real and fake items of news, but we'll see more details about that in just a moment. So what we have here with a perceptual judgment task is a set of trials in which, just as we saw before, you see flickering dots in the first round, where you have either low or high confirmatory evidence. In other words, I make it very difficult for you or very easy for you, because I want to modulate one's starting confidence level. I want to modulate one's confidence level so that it's artificially higher in certain half the trials and lower in the other half of trials, because I want to see what gating function confidence plays. Is it easier for you to change your mind if you start with lower confidence, in other words? And then we have the second round. You've given your confidence level. Either you think, you know what, coin flip, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, which it was, left or right box. Or if I'm absolutely certain, I bet the house on it, right? And I have this bonus round of information that I provide to the participants, where you can decide, again, left or right, but with weak or strong evidence in the post-decision round, where it's either the exact same stimulus trial you saw in the first round, or I've manipulated the log ratio distribution of the dots, so it's easier to see what the correct answer is. So it's strong evidence to help you find the correct answer. Are you using that evidence the way you should to correct yourself? That's the question. And the analytic decision task took a little while to put this together, but what we had decided to do is to come up with a task where it's more abstract. You use your semantic memory. You have to use your crystallized knowledge structures in order to decide what the correct answer is. In this case, the participant is presented with 2 countries, in this case Spain and the Philippines, and they're asked which of the 2 countries has a larger population. Same format. You give your confidence level. And now the evidence source is social, just like it would be in an online environment, where if you're trying to decide whether you're going to believe a news source is real or not, or trustworthy or not, you're probably using your peers as a cue of whether or not to trust this information. So in this case, it's all artificial. We tell the participants that this is data we have collected from other participants. Not true. This is all artificial, what we came up with. And it shows up as a set of icons, where, in this case, 1 previous participant thought Spain was the correct answer, and 3 thought the Philippines was the correct answer. And you use this information to decide whether you're going to shift your confidence around, up or down, keep it the same. So you get an opportunity to change one's answer. And we have 2 conditions for each segment of this task. For low and high distance trials, meaning the rank ordering of the countries is such that they're within 1 or 2 rankings of each other. The population levels are very close. That's low distance. That's a harder condition. More difficult to decide what the correct answer is. So there your confidence would be a little bit lower, we hypothesize. And the high distance, because you have, say, China versus the Philippines, much bigger distance, your confidence is probably a little bit higher in that case. And then for the peer votes, we make it to where the ratio of the votes distribution is shifted for being closer together for the weak and then further apart for the strong. Again, stronger social evidence to support one's view or to disconfirm one's view. And then misinformation susceptibility task. We use stimuli from Rand and Pennycook, who's an expert on fake news research. And what we did with this particular task is we have a set of 15 real news items and 15 fake news items, balanced in terms of ideological persuasion. So some of these items might if it's a fake item, it might say something that's kind of derogatory about conservatives, right? Which is meant to be more appealing to those who have a more liberal point of view, and vice versa with the other side of the trials, in both the real and the fake news items, meaning either they're completely fabricated or they're actual events that had happened, and we can use data from a performance on this task to determine whether one is susceptible to believing misinformation overall. We also have a set of surveys, self-report surveys, that were incorporated into this experimental lineup. Demographics, actively open-minded thinking, etc., which we'll look at in more detail presently. So political ideology, we assess overall political attitudes on a spectrum of extremely liberal to extremely conservative, but also we bifurcate it into economic views, say on taxes, trade and labor, and also on health, welfare, and tradition for the social issues, seeing that those two can become decoupled. For dogmatism, as we said before, this is more so about intolerance for those who don't share one's views. Left-wing authoritarianism is, again, authoritarianism but with a left-wing flavor, mostly antipathy towards those who are wealthier. And then right-wing authoritarianism. This is the right-wing flavoring of authoritarianism, where typically it's about stalwart support for one's traditional values and wanting to impose those on those in the community who disagree. And conspiratorial ideation refers to statements that are notoriously common online that speak to a general lack of trust in fellow members of one's community and in the country at large, in the government, for instance. A lot of COVID questions is what I decided to put in here because it seemed appropriate for the times. It's because of COVID-related disinformation that I was inspired to do this work to begin with. So I decided to throw a few of those items in there as well. For recruitment, I ended up recruiting about 600 participants. I wanted to counterbalance across the ideological spectrum. So Prolific is an online recruitment platform where I can choose which pre-screening measures to include to have it highly precise and customized as far as what participants I bring on board. It's political work, so you have to have a large sample. It's the only way you're going to have anything that's worthwhile. So 200 conservatives, 200 moderates, 200 liberals, pre-survey for these views. I used the surveys you saw earlier to validate whether or not the pre-screening was actually accurate or not. Pre-screen features on Prolific ensure the sample is balanced. I also compensated participants, and they were told that their performance on the tasks were being assessed to determine their bonus pay. After dropping participants due to the normal things that happen with online studies, attention checks, data quality, considerations, etc., we wound up with a final number of 567 participants. Procedures for informed consent, perceptual judgment tasks, analytic decision tasks, misinformation susceptibility tasks, all counterbalanced. Demographics and surveys items, and then debriefing, all taking place on Gorilla Experiment Builder, which is a platform for hosting experimental tasks. Now, we get to our hypotheses and experimental results. So, for aim 1, metacognitive sensitivity is being domain general. What we predicted is that metacognitive sensitivity scores would correlate across perceptual analytic domains. What we found is that meta D prime, which is our little index, it's our fancy little term for whether or not you have higher or lower metacognitive sensitivity. The higher it is on the scale, the more metacognitive sensitivity you have. The lower it is on the scale, the worse it is. And this is just basically a breakdown of how the trials would look if I were to separate, correct, incorrect, high and low confidence, etc. Just showing what it looks like in its raw data form before we transform it. Calculate 2 distinct sets of meta D prime scores from the initial decision phase. That's just when the initial judgments on the task. For 2 sets, one for perceptual, one for analytic decision task. Here's a distribution of the meta D prime scores that we got from the perceptual task. So we can see that most were slightly above average, between 0 and 1, and we had a few who skewed a little bit higher their metacognitive sensitivity. Analytic decision task, we see that we have similar distribution, a few more scoring on the lower end on this task compared to the perceptual task, perhaps just given the nature of having to rely on one's assessment of one's semantic knowledge base with abstract thinking. But here's the unveiling of the finding. So it turns out that one's metacognitive sensitivity scores do not correlate across tasks. What we see here on the X and the Y axes is the mean meta D prime score for each task, and what we see is they don't really fall into contact with one another. So interesting. What does that tell us? So either metacognitive efforts are exerted asymmetrically across the task concepts, meaning they have a common substrate of metacognitive sensitivity, and I'm using that differently in each task, or perhaps more interestingly, there are distinct metacognitive systems that subserve our confidence calibration across task concepts. And this would be more in line with Mercier and Sperber, these researchers who think of our perceptual thinking and our reasoning-based thinking as being two separate domains in general, with their own cognitive systems subserving them. Calibration of confidence about one's semantic knowledge base, geographical knowledge from the analytic task, does not seem to align with confidence assessments and the perceptual judgments. Now for aim 2. Metacognitive sensitivity reduces confirmation bias. That's our hypothesis. Meaning if you have higher metacognitive sensitivity, you have lower confirmation bias scores. For those with higher metacognitive sensitivity, the way we're operationalizing this is that you have a larger upward shift in confidence following confirmatory evidence and larger downward shifts in confidence following disconfirmatory evidence on both of those tasks. So in other words, you're using the evidence the way you should. You're boosting your confidence on round 2 when you're right, and you're lowering your confidence on round 2 when you're wrong, because that would mean you're accepting, oh, I'm wrong about this. Well done. We're also going to be exploring how confidence is influenced by your initial evidence conditions, right? Whether you're starting high or low, valence of your initial decision accuracy, whether you're correct or incorrect, and post-decision evidence strength, weak versus strong evidence. Here's a distribution of the starting confidence ratings as a function of the percentage of all trials from initial confidence as a proportion of the total trials. In blue, you have your analytical task, and in orange, you have your perceptual task. And what we see here is that starting confidence skews lower on the perceptual task than it does on the analytical task. So what that tells us is that for whatever reason, our participants start with much higher confidence when you don't have the benefit of any sort of evidence to begin with. I'm just left to my own devices and what I think about the populations of these countries. I'm more likely to start higher with my confidence compared to the perceptual task, little flickering dots. They're much more humble and thinking, not so sure about this. I'm going to skew a little bit lower with my confidence. So we already see an asymmetry with how these two tasks are being interfaced with by our participants. Confidence shifts from initial to post-decision as a proportion of total number of trials. So now what we're seeing in the analytic task, look in the very center here on our x-axis. You see where it says 0 there? What we're seeing is that most of the time, we're not seeing shifts at all, higher or lower. They're sticking to their first answer. Interesting, right? Because one thing we observe with online behavior when it comes to how we look at information is stubbornness. I'm sticking to my answer no matter what you say. We have social information on this analytic task, and we're seeing a similar pattern, eliciting what we expected we would see, right? Kind of a nice little validation of our task, if I might say so myself. As for the perceptual task, we're seeing a lot more movement. In this case, decrements, decreases in confidence, the way you would hope to see, right? So when it's perceptual information, much more willingness to integrate that into one's decision-making framework. I like these graphs. They're pretty, aren't they? Basically, what they're showing is that on the left, for the perceptual task, correct trials on the left, incorrect trials on the right. We're seeing how confidence shifts from first round to second round. And we see, look at the very top there in that orange band, that's when you start with the highest confidence level. When you're correct, you're more likely to stick to your first answer. Good, because you're right. And then if we look on the incorrect trials, we see when proven incorrect with the second round of evidence, strong evidence, right? We're seeing a shift all the way down to an answer switch, all the way to the other side. So we're getting a nice readout of how confidence has a gating role, right? Because we see with low confidence on correct trials, much more movement. That's in that green band at the very bottom. Same thing on the incorrect trials. So this actually falls in line with the literature, showing that confidence, when one starts with a certain belief or a judgment, seems to determine the lability of one's subsequent beliefs, how we revise our beliefs or fail to do so. Now, with our analytic task, what we see is that for the correct trials, very high confidence levels. This is a proportion of total trials, right? And we're seeing, is again, not a lot of movement here when we start with high confidence. And then in the incorrect trials, we're seeing that compared to perceptual, I'm going to flip back and forth. Look at the incorrect trials. What we're seeing is that when you're incorrect and very confidently, aggressively incorrect, you're not as willing to use the normative features of our evidence conditions to change your beliefs. What does that mean? The social evidence is not being, there's not as much uptake of social evidence compared to perceptual evidence. That tells us something about what kinds of interventions, what kind of information we're willing to use to lower the drawbridge of our minds down in order to allow ourselves to be corrected when we're incorrect about any sort of subject matter. Distribution of confidence shifts from initial to post-decision, depending on whether post-decision evidence was confirmatory or disconfirmatory. So the way this was done was to look and see overall how is confidence shifting either up or down, depending on what task we're looking at. So we see for the analytic task on the top, perceptual task on the bottom. The blue is the incorrect trials. Orange, correct trials. Remember, when we say correct or incorrect, we're only talking about the first round, right? So we're talking about the shift from first round to second round after you get that bonus evidence to decide how you want to update your beliefs. And what we're seeing is that overall, for the incorrect trials, larger changes in confidence level. We see larger shifts downward when incorrect, as opposed to shifts upward when we're correct. So in other words, there's an asymmetry with which how we're using evidence to change our beliefs. Now, this is a little fancy feature, a little statistic speak here, where we use these things called beta weights, which indicates the effect of evidence strength on changes in confidence from initial to post-decision. We want to know, in other words, if you have strong evidence and say it cuts against your first answer, meaning it's disconfirmatory, how is that going to impact your decision making? And what we see is that for the incorrect trials in blue, there's much larger shift or impact of the evidence on our decision making compared to the confirmatory evidence when it's strong. In other words, much bigger psychological impact and punch when you have an interaction of the valence, meaning the evidence is disconfirmatory, it's showing you were wrong, and if it's stronger evidence, it's making a still larger impact on one's decision making. Now, what we found is that looking at the meta D prime scores, metacognitive sensitivity scores that we had from AIM-1, and we wanted to see what impact would that have on shifts in confidence on the perceptual task. The beta weights. What we see is that if you have higher metacognitive sensitivity on the x-axis, you're more likely to decrease your confidence on the second round trials. What does that mean? Well, quite excitingly, what that means is that if you have higher metacognitive sensitivity, you do in fact lower the drawbridge of your mind, you let in that disconfirmatory evidence, and you're more likely to say, yeah, I'm wrong, I admit it, I'm changing my confidence. It shows that metacognitive sensitivity does in fact matter to confirmation bias. And when it comes to the true trials, like when you're correct, what we see is that with high metacognitive sensitivity, that you're more willing to increase your confidence the way you should. So it's good to be wrong and low confidence. It's also good to be right with high confidence. So you see in both directions on that second round decision making, an improvement of one's overall assessment of evidence in both cases. We didn't see that, by the way, on the analytic task. This was only perceptual task, just flagging that. Now, most exciting finding of the whole experiment, I would say, is that, again, with the perceptual task, not the analytic task, that's on the left, and the perceptual task is on the right, what we see is that meta D prime scores, higher metacognitive sensitivity, it correlates with the confidence shift on the incorrect trials in the downward direction. This is just another way of viewing what we saw earlier, mainly that you're going to decrease your confidence when you're shown to be wrong. And how about a change in mind altogether? It's one thing if, say you start off wrong and I go down like one confidence, I go from like 6 to 5. All right, cool, I'm less confident, but I'm still wrong. Well, how about change my mind completely? I go from the incorrect answer to the correct answer on the other end. What we see here is that more changes of mind with higher meta D prime scores. So, final aim. Political cognition. This is where we get to our application part. So how about lower metacognitive sensitivity and the increased levels of all those aspects of political cognition that we want to see less of, like authoritarianism, dogmatism, extremism, etc., and misinformation susceptibility. So what we did to simplify things, we did what's called exploratory factor analysis, where it means you take all the surveys, you just throw them into a blender, and you see what kind of bubbles to the surface as far as what factors show up that explain correlations and anti-correlations among your survey items. That's just a fancy way of saying, okay, I take a bunch of survey items and I see what answers all kind of hang together into a pattern, right? And which types of items kind of move in opposite directions. And what we found is that there are four factors that explain most of the variance. And those are the factors that we use on this analysis. It's like an overall assessment of one's political thinking. So here's just a breakdown of all the survey items and showing whenever you see things above the lines, those are items that correlate with each other, right? They kind of track each other. And then when you see the bars kind of going below the line, it means they're anti-correlated, meaning they kind of go in the opposite direction, predicting one's response patterns. We have four factors. We name them right-wing conspiratorial ideation, anti-democratic attitudes, left-wing conspiratorial ideation, and dogmatic intolerance. That's what was used for our exploratory factor analysis. And our hypotheses were that we would see decreases on all of these if you have higher metacognitive sensitivity. So what we find is that if we look at all of those factors, it's really just factor 4, that dogmatic intolerance one. That's where we get a significant finding. Metacognitive sensitivity is negatively correlated with dogmatic intolerance. In other words, if you have higher metacognitive sensitivity, you're a little more open-minded. You're not as judgmental of people in your community who don't share your views. It's a small effect, but it's there. Meaning that if you look at the continuum from what happens under the hood in our minds with how we assess our own beliefs, assess our own interface with evidence, that does tend to matter to how I think interpersonally with others around me and what kinds of perhaps conversations I'm willing to have with people, whether I'm open in general to talking to those in my community who aren't like me. And what we found is that there was no significant association with meta D prime and political ideology. In other words, you're not more likely to be left-wing or right-wing, which I was actually happy to find. Turns out that just because you have high metacognitive sensitivity doesn't mean that you lean in one direction or the other on the political spectrum. So there's hope for all of us. How about that? It's a feel-good story. Okay. Misinformation susceptibility is assessed as error rate. Simple enough, right? That's with the fake news items, real news items. That's basically just saying the ratio of when you know a real item is real and a fake item is fake. And what we find here is that meta D prime is not a significant predictor of higher error rate. That tells us, again, something about the social elements of evidence. There's like a breakdown, isn't there? There's a breakdown to when peers and social factors come into play, where metacognitive sensitivity seems to make less of a difference. We also saw that in analytic decision task, right? We should all remember that. So same thing here with fake news assessment. However, what we did find is that the beta weights for confirmation bias, what we showed is that if you have higher beta weights, meaning you're better at decreasing your confidence when you're wrong on this perceptual task, that we're more likely, you're better at finding fake news. Meaning, in general, if you're better at shifting your confidence downward on that perceptual task, those same individuals are better at figuring out what the real news items and the fake news items are. So it seems the confirmation bias element is a better predictor than the metacognitive sensitivity element. Same thing goes for the true beta weights. When you're better at increasing your confidence the way you should on the perceptual task, those are the same people who are better at finding real news and fake news items. What are our key takeaways? Well, metacognitive sensitivity contributes to open-minded receptivity to correct information. When our beliefs are challenged, there is considerable power in admitting to oneself, I could be wrong. Vulnerability to confirmation bias underlies conspiratorial ideation, misinformation susceptibility. Attachment to empirically unsupported beliefs impedes exploratory thinking and willingness to revise one's judgments. It's a nice little takeaway, I think, for us to see how does that impact our lives as individuals. Further directions. Well, my plan here is to investigate how different cognitive styles, let's say your tendency to think in black and white ways, whether you're comfortable with ambiguity in the world. How does that interact with metacognitive sensitivity? Does that contribute to reduced susceptibility to confirmation bias and intolerant political attitudes? And finally, evaluating behavioral interventions that aim to improve metacognitive sensitivity, determining whether this construct is a fixed trait or a skill that is trainable. In other words, let's say you don't have good metacognitive sensitivity. Can I help you with that? Can I help you improve it with a training program? Or is it just a trait you either have or you don't? I think that would be worthwhile to investigate. And then ultimately, if I improve your metacognitive sensitivity scores, how does that impact your political thinking? So I want to see a transfer across domains. Very grateful for the Friends of Brain Health Award and the Diane Cash Fellowship that made all of this work possible. Could not have had such a massive sample without this generous funding, so I'm very grateful for that. These are some key collaborators who have been with me since the start of this project, helped me with data analysis, some of the conceptual bedrock of this work. And of course, all the members of the Kmiecik Reasoning Lab. I'm very grateful to everyone's support, and also thank you, Dan, for allowing me to take this unusual trajectory of our lab's work, because I realize what a rare opportunity this is as a doctoral student, where you're handed a blank canvas by your PI and said, I'm trusting you to kind of move off in this uncharted direction, and I'm very grateful for that. And I think it's helped to bear some great fruit, and I'm very excited to see what comes next in this journey. So thank you for your time, your generosity of your attention. Very excited to hear everyone's thoughts and questions, and thank you. I'm very grateful.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Michael. Many different directions we could go with the discussion. At this point, welcome any questions from the audience or online.
Really great job, Michael. Thank you. Non-scientist here. I have a number of acquaintances that I would love to send through this experiment and see where they land. Do you see the possibility of kind of gamifying it to the point that it could be easily delivered to all?
Right. I think this gets down to questions of assessment, as well as perhaps even the trainability of the trait itself of metacognitive sensitivity. Of course, what we see here is just some ways metacognitive sensitivity could be assessed, right? So you have an index or a score, but also this question of motivation. It's one thing to find out, okay, metacognitive sensitivity matters. Well, now I need to be motivated to care about this and do something about it. I would say there probably are ways to assess this in such a way where it could be gamified, where there's something that is intrinsically valuable to oneself or even enjoyable. The experience of realizing, okay, I'm becoming more and more masterful of my own mind, right? A better steward of my mind, the intellectual hygiene element of metacognitive sensitivity. I think that is one of the exciting developments that's coming around the corner for this line of work.
So my nutshell takeaway was that like the tribe that you're in has a greater impact on what you're going to, how you're going to vote or how your political thinking is. Is that a correct takeaway? Is that the influences that you surround yourself with, first of all, will be have a greater impact than the analytics? I'm sorry, I got the two confused.
No. I think I see what you're driving at there with your question. There's a breakdown so that we see when it comes to metacognitive sensitivity, for the more practical, perceptual judgments, it seems to make an impact, right? But there's a breakdown. As soon as you move to the continuum of something that's more abstract, something that's more social, we see that metacognitive sensitivity seems to make less of a difference. And as you're pointing out here, perhaps one's social ties, one's social community, one's tribal allegiances, politically speaking, seem to present an obstacle or a roadblock to the ability of one's thinking, the ability to be flexible and admit that one might in fact be wrong.
Because where it had me thinking was in two spots here. of the great experiment in a classroom where they draw one line and then they draw a slightly larger line, and the children don't want to be spotted out, in amongst the group of thinking differently. And then the other part of that is that, when people are within the tribe, to her question is like, would I want to find out if I don't? Do I want to find out the truth of how flexible am I? Because can I hold contradicting thoughts? Can I personally think that line is shorter than the other one, but I don't want to admit to that in front of all these folks? And does that play, could that play a role? Because people vote differently in the booth than they may say in their social circle.
I think what this shows is that the goals that might be driving my behavior make a major difference. So you might have accuracy-oriented goals. I want to be right about this, versus I want to showcase my allegiance to my group. I want to belong to this group and make it absolutely clear I can be a trusted and loyal member of this group. That's a different axis orientation altogether. And they can be orthogonal to each other, right? In fact, Gordon Pennycook, whose work I mentioned earlier in fake news, what he showed is that there are interventions that can be used so that we skew or nudge participants more so towards their accuracy goals as opposed to their affiliative goals, right? Where I'm trying to broadcast my tribal loyalties, and they're more likely to be able to pick up on real versus fake news items. And perhaps this translates to more perceptual-based decisions, as you were giving an example of earlier. I think that the underlying goals, the tacit goals that are driving one's decision-making, whether they're accuracy-oriented or affiliative-oriented, make a major difference to that inflection point of how one is going to form a judgment in a perceptual case.
Okay, I will introduce two questions from the online audience that I think go well together. One, does intelligence have a relationship to metacognitive sensitivity? And secondly, does religiosity factor into these results in any way that you've looked at? And I think that's good to address these together, because we think of intelligence having a highly heritable component, and we think of religiosity being heavily environment-based. So I guess really that's a sort of environmental versus personality genetics kind of question.
I'm so happy that as we're drawing to the end of this talk that I can throw a few grenades out there to, get a little bit of heat and light to wake us back up, because I know we all had a nice meal here. It's heavy on the stomach, so I want to generate some excitement here. Okay, first question, intelligence. Keith Stanovich did some work trying to figure out whether IQ scores kind of interact in interesting ways with confirmation bias. And what he found is that if you have a higher IQ in general, you're more likely to engage in confirmation bias, because you're better at adducing arguments to protect your beliefs. You have a very agile, high-octane, redlining mind, where if somebody's trying to throw anything at the bulwark and the fortress of your belief system, you can you can take on all comers, right? So that's an interesting thought here.
What a grenade to launch at an academic crowd.
Oh, for sure. They're all hopeless.
Smarter is not better in this case.
You're all hopelessly in the grips of confirmation bias, but hey, what are you going to do? So the thing is, it seems like intelligence isn't really the factor here. That's why metacognitive sensitivity is the interesting factor I wanted to look at, because it's actually, it's a distinct trait from intelligence. Just because you're more intelligent doesn't mean that you have higher metacognitive sensitivity, right? In fact, in some ways, maybe it can be an issue. It's because you trust yourself so much, because you're right so often, right? You're not as likely to scrutinize your own beliefs. So I would say when we're working on metacognitive sensitivity, this is not to be conflated with you're becoming more intelligent. Religiosity. Here's the other controversial belief that I have about this. Religiosity is an attitude one has about one's belief system. We're all religious. It just depends on what factors or what is the referent, what is the object of one's sense of what's fundamental, what is most important to one's beliefs and values. That's what's religious to you. You can be secular but religious, in my opinion, because you can be dogmatic about your beliefs and flexible and saying, yes, I derive all my sense of truth, justice, right and wrong from this particular belief system. So from what I've seen looking at the data, it's not religiosity per se that's going to make much of a difference. It just comes down to what is most important to you, what's most sacred to who you are and most fundamental to your values and your belief systems. That is going to determine where you're going to be least flexible, least willing to integrate information that would threaten that belief system.
Okay, some questions on the other side of the room there.
Hi, Michael. That was very, very interesting. Of all the questions I could ask, I wanted to know if you've looked at like timeline, like, you know, so much information right now about this is about social media having an impact and having an impact on our ability to think about government and, you know, types of government. It just seems like it feels like it's getting worse. And so is there some kind of pattern? I mean, I don't imagine that people's abilities have changed, but what has changed that makes it worse now than before, I guess? And you know, why is that a threat to democracy per se at this point?
I think the best way to approach this sort of question is, what should be the object of modification here? Should it be on the supply side with the social media giants themselves? Is it their responsibility? Should they protect ourselves from ourselves, right? In the sense of, all right, things are getting worse. Clearly they are. What do? Do we turn to the heads of Facebook and Twitter and other social media giants and say, well, you all figure this out because you need to shield us from this problem? Or is the inevitable going to occur, in my opinion, which is that the last thing you want to do with somebody who has a conspiracy mindset is to confirm their beliefs. You don't want to do that. You don't want to victimize them and make them feel like they're being ostracized and pushed out of the fold, pushed out of the public forum, because that would only play into the narrative of oh, I guess I was right. I guess I am the bête noire of the society. I guess no one wants me here. So I'm going to form my own little enclave on another social media platform, and now I'm even more surrounded with people who are like myself. That's one approach, the supply side. You can already tell, without me saying it directly, how I feel about that, and that's in the prospects on that front. Then there's consumer side. What we do as stewards of ourselves. I think we empower individuals is what we do. I think it comes down to intellectual humility, realizing what your weaknesses are, knowing what your mind allows you to do well, and what weaknesses are inherent to the human mind, and admitting that and controlling for it, accounting for that. I don't think that conversation is as prevalent as it should be. And I think the vocabulary that we have available to ourselves, like metacognitive sensitivity, is that something we talk about in coffee shops that often? If it becomes more prevalent, we have a toolkit. You have a way of mapping your system of language onto what you can do to improve your abilities on that front, to know how to control for how confident should I be about what I'm reading? What news sources should I trust? Is it because this particular news source comes from a political group that I agree with? Am I going to let my guard down and not be as vigilant? Those kinds of questions, I think, again, consumer side, equipping us to be more capable, higher acumen on that front might be a better prospect for turning the trend line in a more positive direction for the prospects of our democratic institutions.
I want to take over, but I'm just going to ask a follow-up question because I did think the intelligence question is so interesting, but to me there's a difference between intelligence and education, right? Like level of education, and what you're talking about could be translated to intelligence in that you're learning. Like there is an education and a learning curve to get that to happen that you could view as intelligence, but just either way as a background to education in this whole subject in general, right?
Oh, for sure. There's a bifurcation between the hardware and the software, right? Intelligence might refer to the hardware, right? I'm working with an 8-cylinder or a 6-cylinder up here, right? And the software, the crystallized knowledge structures, the semantic knowledge I have to work with and bring to the surface, the tools I have available to me for thinking. Those are two separate matters. And I think that when it comes to certain aspects of our minds that are more amenable to influence for when it comes to education, it's that mindware or software element. The tools we have available to us that I think seems like a more worthwhile target for training, for intervention. And I think that's perfectly in line with the trajectory of this work and where I want to see it leading.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one final question.
So over the past few years, I've seen an increase in information literacy courses being taught at like middle school and high school, which made me really excited, thinking that we could fix problems like this. But after your presentation, I'm wondering if that's a very narrow range, if even a part of metacognitive sensitivity. So do you think information literacy courses would actually have an effect on metacognitive sensitivity?
It's a great question. I remember a few years ago, I was a part of this forum on basically just taking stock of trends and changes in direction for curriculum for the school system. And digital literacy came up as one of these important matters. I think the best way to approach this is to equip students with an understanding of the minds that they have. There should be a psychological element to this. It's not merely to say, okay, you're spending time online, you're on social media, let's look at documentaries like The Social Dilemma, right? And figure out how we should be suspicious about certain sources of information, how they might mislead us. Okay, that's one way to approach this. But it can also get down to the bedrock of one's own minds. Instead of waiting and perhaps you just stumble into a psychology classroom and you decide to major in that and you learn about things like confirmation bias, you learn about the weaknesses and strengths of your minds, why not make this a part of the basic curriculum? Why does that have to be an elective? Why does that just by happenstance that you may, in fact, have the privilege of having that sort of knowledge base when you know the one thing that's for certain is, okay, you don't know if you're going to be an accountant, you don't know if you're going to be in graphic design or architecture or mathematician, but you know you're going to have a mind. That much is certain. You're going to have a human mind. And why not make that a mainstay, a permanent element of one's curriculum journey, even in high school? Because I think that there's no reason to think that someone who's a high school student couldn't understand these concepts and to appreciate their relevance to their lives. I think that if that's what we mean by digital literacy, yes, I would say that that seems like a worthwhile prospect for sure.
Okay, we will conclude at this point. Lifelong brain health is our shared mission. I think that's a good segue from what Michael described in those final questions. It's not just something we need to take into consideration with young people. We actually need to make this a lifelong goal to remain aware that we could be wrong and to diversify our news intake in productive ways. I will thank Michael very much for this enlightening talk, and let's give him another round of applause. And I will conclude with some words about the Brain Health Project. The power of research truly lies in how we use it to make the world a better place. So we've launched a large-scale landmark study called the Brain Health Project, which will help people everywhere get proactive about maintaining and improving their brain health and performance. If you're interested in this project, please scan the QR code for the online folks or visit thebrainhealthproject.org. That's thebrainhealthproject.org. If you're interested in continuing education credits for these talks, go ahead and visit ceu.utdallas.edu. Actually, send an email to that. And thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week for a talk by Matthew Robeson from UT Arlington.